Usually when military planners sit down to map out some uh, grand geopolitical strategy or a kinetic operation, there's this, well, almost arrogant expectation of precision.
Oh, absolutely. It's treated like sterile engineering.
Right. Like you just identify a threat vector, a satellite picks up a little infrared heat signature, the commander points at a screen, and poof, the problem is surgically removed.
Yeah. I mean, it's the ultimate comfort food for defense departments, right? We desperately want modern warfare to be perfectly visible, to be categorized, and to follow this highly predictable chain of cause and effect. You pull lever A and adversary B capitulates.
Exactly. But then you step into the reality of the current just sprawling multi-front conflict in the Middle East, and suddenly that pristine satellite feed is, it's nothing but static.
It really is. We are looking at a strategic landscape that is unapologetically chaotic right now.
Completely. And the initial blueprints for a short, surgical, highly contained war, they haven't just failed. They have completely evaporated upon contact with reality.
Evaporated is a good word for it. We are witnessing the absolute definition of strategic muddy waters.
Yeah.
What started with a set of very specific, highly confident assumptions from Western and Israeli intelligence has mutated into something that defies almost every conventional military model we have.
And that is exactly where we are going today. So welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive, created just for you. Today, we're tearing apart the illusion of the short war. We're looking at what happens when flawless intelligence turns out to be a myth, when trillion-dollar defense budgets can't stop $20,000 drones.
Right.
And when the global economy basically gets held hostage at a maritime choke point.
A massive scope.
It is. We are basing this analysis on a really fascinating, incredibly dense dialogue between commentator Mario Nawfal and analyst Nima Rostami. They unpack this huge war involving the U.S., Israel, Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the immensely wealthy yet highly vulnerable Gulf states.
But before we dive into the mechanisms of how this conflict spiraled, I think we need to establish a non-negotiable framework for how we handle this material.
Yes, definitely.
Because the analysis from Nawfal and Rostami, it contains incredibly sensitive, highly politically charged claims. We're talking about ongoing kinetic operations, government motives, shifting historical alliances.
Yeah, so let me make this explicitly clear to you, the listener. We are entirely impartial here.
Completely.
We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the claims, or the specific geopolitical narratives of either Nawfal or Rostami. Our sole job is to neutrally report and vigorously analyze the strategic arguments they are laying out.
Exactly. If a strategy looks fundamentally flawed on paper, or an assumption that seems disconnected from reality, we are going to break down exactly why, regardless of whose flag is attached to it.
Right. We're evaluating the architecture of the arguments. Okay, let's unpack this. The foundational argument Rostami presents is that this entire sprawling war is built on a catastrophic initial miscalculation regarding human behavior.
Yeah, he asserts that the initial strategy deployed by the U.S. and Israel was predicated almost entirely on this illusion of a quick regime change inside Iran.
Which is wild. Let's unpack the sheer psychological hubris of that assumption for a second. The working theory was apparently that if you just apply enough intense kinetic military pressure, the Iranian populace will essentially do the invading army's job for them.
Right, that they'll take to the streets, overthrow their own government, and welcome a new political order.
It's a recurring theme in Western military planning. And yet, it almost never works the way it does in the think tank white papers.
No, it rarely does. Because strategically speaking, it is a staggering gamble. You're basing your entire military campaign, your logistics, your timelines, not on degrading the enemy's physical military infrastructure, but on, predicting the psychological breaking point of 80+ million civilians.
Which is impossible to calculate.
Exactly. And Rostami points out that this strategy failed comprehensively. The internal coup did not materialize. And when that core assumption collapsed, the entire nature of the war had to violently shift gears.
Right. It pivoted from a decisive surgical strike into this grueling, incredibly destructive war of attrition. And you can actually trace this desperation through the erratic timelines coming out of Washington.
Oh, the shifting ultimatums.
Yes. The analysis details Donald Trump reportedly issuing these wildly shifting ultimatums toward Iran. It started as a 48-hour window, then it quietly extended to 5 days. Then suddenly it was a 10-day ultimatum.
Which is very telling.
I mean, when a global superpower keeps moving its own red lines, it's usually a neon sign that the initial leverage just doesn't exist.
And as those timelines stretch, the target list drastically changed, which, by the way, is the most telling metric of a stalled campaign. They stopped focusing purely on military installations and began a systematic targeting of civilian and energy infrastructure.
Yeah, the text specifically tracks attacks on desalination plants in the southern islands, major steel factories, heavy water plants in the central regions, even strikes affecting the Bushehr nuclear power plant.
Right.
Let's stop and look at the logic of that because it feels completely backwards to me.
Right.
It's like trying to knock over a Jenga tower by pulling the bottom block, but when the tower doesn't fall, you just start smashing the table.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, if you are ostensibly winning the war, as some military briefings claimed, why pivot to attack a desalination plant? That's not a military target. That's the mechanism that provides drinking water to a civilian population. If you have the upper hand, you hit the anti-aircraft batteries, not the municipal plumbing.
Well, that is the pivotal paradox that Nawfal and Rostami debate. Rostami argues that hitting foundational pillars of daily civilian life is fundamentally an act of strategic desperation. Yeah, if you are successfully degrading their military apparatus, you keep hitting the apparatus. Shifting to the water supply means you are trying to inflict a level of collective civilian suffering to force a political capitulation that your military just couldn't achieve on the battlefield.
But logically, doesn't that completely backfire? If your initial grand strategy was to get the Iranian people to turn against their government, destroying their civilian infrastructure accomplishes the exact opposite.
It really does.
Think about it. If a foreign power destroys the plant that keeps my city from dying of thirst, I'm not suddenly going to embrace that foreign power as a liberator. I'm going to rally fiercely behind my own government out of sheer visceral survival instinct.
You've just described the rally around the flag effect. It's a very well-documented psychological phenomenon in warfare. You end up consolidating the very regime you were explicitly trying to topple.
Right.
When survival becomes the daily priority, political dissent is entirely marginalized. By destroying the infrastructure, the attacking forces effectively bonded the population to the state.
So the strategy engineers its own failure. But okay, if the initial strategy was based on such deeply flawed psychological assumptions, we have to look at the machinery that fed those assumptions to the policymakers in the first place.
The intelligence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We have to look at the intelligence. And this brings us to one of the most jarring deconstructions in Rostami's analysis, the unmasking of the omnipotent intelligence myth.
Yeah, this is a huge point. For decades, the globally accepted narrative, one that borders on cinematic mythology, honestly, is that Israeli intelligence, specifically Mossad, operates a flawless, microscopic intelligence network embedded deep within Iran.
The idea that they see everything.
Right. The prevailing belief was that they had eyes in every room, that they could pinpoint a specific individual anywhere at any time. But Rostami bluntly categorizes this as a manufactured illusion.
He argues that the progression of this war proves Iran actually managed to systematically dismantle those internal intelligence cells. Now, initially, that sounds counterintuitive because the analysis clearly points to very high-profile, successful assassinations. We are talking about the elimination of the supreme leader of Iran, the head of the Supreme National Security Council, and various high-ranking commanders being taken out on a seemingly weekly basis.
Yes, the targets were undeniably eliminated. But Rostami forces us to look at how they were eliminated. These figures were not found hiding in secret subterranean military bunkers.
No.
They were targeted in standard, everyday civilian buildings living in heavily populated areas. And the kinetic strikes used to eliminate them were not the surgical pinpoint operations the mythology would suggest.
They were horrifyingly blunt. The operational reality of these assassinations is staggering. Rostami claims that in one specific operation, to kill a single high-value target, the intelligence apparatus didn't actually know the exact room or even the exact building the target was in.
Right.
So to guarantee the kill, they just leveled the entire neighborhood. Over 500 civilians were reportedly killed in a single strike just to ensure one individual was eliminated.
Which fundamentally changes the definition of actionable intelligence.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because someone might argue, well, even if it was messy and caused massive civilian casualties, they still got the targets. Doesn't that mean the intelligence actually worked?
Well, let's look at it through Rostami's counter-argument. True intelligence is surgical. If you possess this legendary omnipotent intelligence network, you know the exact chair the target is sitting in. You use a low-yield precision munition.
Yeah.
Having to level a neighborhood of 500 people implies your intelligence only gave you a general zip code, not a pinpoint coordinate. It proves they are operating partially blind.
I want to use an analogy here
Yeah.
because the scale of that failure really needs to be understood. It's like a tech company claiming they have a hyper-advanced surgical algorithm that can identify and delete a specific virus on a hard drive.
Okay.
But when you ask them to demonstrate it, their actual solution is just throwing the entire laptop into an industrial incinerator. I mean, you got the virus, sure, but that's not precision. That is a catastrophic lack of granular data.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. It's a wrecking ball, not a scalpel. And even the political leadership seems to be waking up to this reality.
Right, the G.D. Vance call.
Exactly. The analysis references a reported phone call between U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Vance allegedly told Netanyahu that the intelligence packages being provided to the United States were, quote, too optimistic and not realistic.
Wow. When your chief geopolitical ally starts questioning the fundamental accuracy of your targeting data, the entire foundation of the war effort is shaking.
Furthermore, Rostami points out the operational futility of these decapitation strikes. Despite leveling neighborhoods to kill these high-ranking commanders, it has done absolutely nothing to reduce Iran's actual military capabilities or its asymmetric ability to return fire.
Which speaks to the design of their military apparatus, right?
Sure.
If you cut off the head, the machine doesn't stop. It just routes the commands through a decentralized network. The missiles still launch. So the intelligence was muddy, the psychological assumptions were wrong, and the regime change failed. But the miscalculations didn't stop at Iran's borders. We have to look at the massive blind spots regarding the proxy forces sitting right on Israel's doorstep.
Yes, the multi-front squeeze.
Exactly. Let's talk about the resurgence of Hezbollah. Early in this conflict, there was a widespread, almost consensus-level assumption among Western analysts that Hezbollah was effectively finished.
Oh, yeah. This belief was fueled by a string of high-profile assassinations of their key leaders, most notably Hassan Nasrallah. Add to that the broader geopolitical shifts like the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria.
Right, which everyone assumed permanently severed Hezbollah's logistical supply lines.
Exactly. The narrative was that Hezbollah was a completely spent force.
Decapitated and boxed in. But the reality on the ground, as detailed in the source, is a massive, highly coordinated counteroffensive that seemingly caught everyone off guard.
What's fascinating here is just how overwhelming it's been.
Right. We aren't talking about isolated skirmishes. The text highlights sustained, daily rocket barrages deep into Israeli territory. It mentions severe ground clashes in Lebanon, specifically a mass casualty event involving Israeli helicopters during a botched invasion attempt.
The internal systemic pressure this creates is immense. The analysis references internal metrics and statements from the IDF Chief of Staff indicating that the Israeli army is profoundly struggling, even using the term collapsing under the sheer logistical and psychological weight of fighting a synchronized multi-front war.
They're being compressed from multiple directions by forces they literally thought were eradicated. But why is Hezbollah doing this now? The motivations are fiercely debated between Nawfal and Rostami.
They are, and it's a fascinating look at how different analysts read the exact same battlefield data. Mario takes a very critical view. He argues that Hezbollah has essentially betrayed the nation of Lebanon.
Right, dragging them into a war.
Yeah, in his view, by initiating these strikes, Hezbollah dragged an already fragile Lebanese state into a devastating, catastrophic war purely to act as a pressure release valve for Iran. They are sacrificing Lebanese civilian infrastructure just to keep the IDF distracted.
It's a classic critique of proxy warfare, right? The proxy sacrifices its host for the sponsor.
But Rostami offers a completely different, highly opportunistic strategic analysis. He argues that Hezbollah is not just blindly following suicidal orders from Tehran. Instead, they are recognizing and seizing a very rare, highly specific strategic window.
A window that opened up due to the broader regional conflict. But what exactly is the window? Because inviting massive retaliatory airstrikes onto your own territory doesn't sound like a strategic opportunity.
It comes down to the math of air defense. According to Rostami, the sustained barrage of Iranian ballistic and hypersonic missiles has severely degraded, or in some areas depleted, Israel's tiered air defense systems. Because the Iron Dome, David's Sling, and the Arrow systems are stretched to their absolute limits dealing with the larger Iranian threat, Hezbollah suddenly has an unprecedented tactical advantage.
The shield is looking the other way.
Exactly. Hezbollah is using this temporary degradation of Israeli air superiority to mount an aggressive offensive. Their goal is pushing Israeli forces completely out of any disputed Lebanese territory. They view this as a fleeting, now or never moment.
While the Israeli military apparatus is hyper-distracted and its defenses are thinned out, and this fear of losing territory isn't just a theoretical exercise, it's a very real existential undercurrent driving the violence.
Absolutely.
The analysis brings up a terrifying rumor. And Nawfal stresses he hopes it's not true, but acknowledges it is deeply embedded in the regional discourse.
The annexation rumor.
Yes, that far-right Israeli government ministers, specifically naming Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, secretly harbor very real, very actionable ambitions to annex southern Lebanon, all the way up to the Litani River.
Right, and if that perception takes hold, it instantly transforms a border skirmish over solidarity into an existential war for national sovereignty. Rostami treats this annexation goal not as a fringe rumor, but as an eventual policy objective of those specific ministers.
Imagine you're a civilian in Lebanon trying to process this. How do you possibly weigh the horrific ongoing destruction of your country against the paralyzing fear that your land might be permanently annexed?
It's an impossible nightmare calculus. You're trapped between the anvil of your own proxy militia and the hammer of a neighboring military.
And it perfectly illustrates how a kinetic operation that was sold as a surgical, contained strike in Iran, has metastasized into an existential territorial crisis bleeding across multiple borders.
It's spilling over everywhere.
Speaking of spilling over, the shockwaves of this conflict are violently shaking nations that honestly thought their geography, their immense wealth, and their ironclad American alliances would keep them perfectly safe.
The Gulf states.
Exactly. Let's look at the wealth trap and how the Arab Gulf states are finding themselves caught directly in the crossfire.
The dynamic here is a total inversion of conventional geopolitical wisdom. The Arab Gulf states were talking about regional heavyweights like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, Kuwait, Bahrain are suddenly finding their financial capitals and shipping ports vulnerable.
And it's wild because on paper, a country like Saudi Arabia should be militarily untouchable.
Right.
The analysis points out that Saudi Arabia possesses the 7th largest defense budget in the entire world. They spend more on their military than France. They spend more than Japan. Their defense budget is literally over 10 times the size of Iran's. By all conventional metrics, they should dictate the terms of regional security.
But as we are seeing play out in real time, raw financial expenditure does not automatically translate into sovereign security, particularly when you are dealing with the economics of asymmetric warfare.
Nawfal brings this abstract concept to life with a really chilling personal anecdote from the source. He lives in Dubai in the UAE. And Dubai is essentially a city built on the very concept of unwavering stability. It's a glittering metropolis that thrives on foreign direct investment, luxury tourism, and expats feeling perfectly safe.
A safe haven.
Right. Yet, Nawfal details how a drone strike hit right next to his apartment building in the Dubai International Financial Center.
Wow.
He mentions another strike just a 5-minute walk away. We also hear reports of Iran striking critical port infrastructure in Oman. The war hasn't just arrived at the borders, it's arrived in the financial hubs.
We have to ask the mechanical question, why? Why is Iran striking countries that, prior to this specific escalation, were not directly involved in a hot, kinetic war with Tehran?
Right.
The underlying cause, according to the analysis, is the lethal interception of geography and historical alliances. These Gulf nations host massive, deeply entrenched American military bases, regional intelligence hubs, and advanced early warning radar systems.
The architecture of American power projection in the Middle East is built right on their soil.
Precisely. And during this current conflict, those American radars and bases are actively being used to defend Israel, to track incoming trajectories, intercept missiles, coordinate U.S. operations.
I see.
Therefore, from Iran's strategic and legal perspective, they aren't necessarily attacking the sovereign state of the UAE or Saudi Arabia. They are targeting American military infrastructure that just happens to be sitting on Arab real estate.
Because those bases are actively participating in the kinetic defense of Israel, they become legitimate, active targets for Iranian retaliation. So the lesson is brutal. If you host the base, you host the war.
That's the reality of it.
But Nawfal introduces a theory about this that I really want to poke at. He asks, doesn't Iran's strategy of hitting these Gulf states completely backfire?
How so?
Well, by bombing the UAE and Saudi Arabia, isn't Iran just forcing these extremely wealthy countries to run and cling even tighter to the United States, for protection? Doesn't bombing them just permanently solidify the exact American alliance Iran is trying to break?
It's a highly logical assumption based on traditional deterrence theory. Sure, if I threaten you, you seek a stronger protector. But Rostami synthesizes this entirely differently.
Okay.
He argues that the psychological goal of these Iranian strikes is to prove the exact opposite to both the Arab populations and their ruling monarchs. The strikes are designed as a visceral, undeniable demonstration that the United States, despite all its sprawling bases and billions of dollars in defense contracts, cannot actually defend these states against asymmetric threats.
It's a demonstration of impotence. They have the 7th largest defense budget on Earth. They spend more than France, but they can't stop a low-flying drone from hitting downtown Dubai.
Exactly.
It's like buying a multi-million-dollar Ferrari but realizing your dad refuses to take off the training wheels and the engine stalls at 30 miles per hour. You have the hardware, but you don't have the systemic capability to use it effectively.
That analogy cuts right to the core of Rostami's geopolitical theory here, because he claims that the ultimate, almost cynical goal of the U.S. and Israel in this specific dynamic is to essentially allow Iran to degrade Arab infrastructure.
Wait, let me stop you right there. That sounds like a massive conspiracy theory. Why on earth would the United States actively want the infrastructure of its own regional allies destroyed?
Well, according to Rostami's framework, it's about engineering permanent leverage.
Leverage.
Yes. If the UAE and Saudi Arabia have their glittering cities, their desalination plants, and their energy grids heavily damaged by Iranian strikes, they become permanently, desperately dependent on Western powers for reconstruction, for advanced security umbrellas, and for their basic economic survival.
It strips away any illusion that they're independent actors.
Right, and Rostami points out a stunning structural detail to back this up. Despite Saudi Arabia buying all these cutting-edge, ultra-expensive American fighter jets, Saudi forces wouldn't even be allowed to fly them without direct American authorization.
Wait, really?
Yeah, or in some cases, American contractors literally maintaining the software. The wealth buys the physical hardware, but it explicitly does not buy the sovereign authority to use it.
So they are entirely trapped. Their massive defense budget is basically decorative if Washington decides to say no. That is a brutal realization for a monarch, assuming they bought security.
And this vulnerability isn't just about drones hitting skyscrapers on land. It extends to the absolute lifeblood of these nations, the water surrounding them.
Right, this paralyzing reliance on American defense doesn't just trap the Gulf states on land, it leaves their entire economic engine completely exposed on the sea. If your military is largely tethered, you have no way to secure your own shipping lanes.
Which brings us to the introduction of the Houthis and the weaponization of maritime chokepoints.
This is a massive escalation, noted in the source. The Houthis in Yemen have officially and aggressively joined the kinetic fight.
This is the moment the conflict breaches regional boundaries and shifts into total global economic warfare.
We already know the strategic stranglehold Iran has historically maintained over the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah.
But pairing that with Houthi control over the al-Mandab Strait fundamentally alters the geometry of global energy markets.
It's a classic macro-level pincer movement.
Yeah.
If you look at the flow of global energy, Iran holds the gateway to the Persian Gulf in the north, and now the Houthis are actively choking off the southern entrance to the Red Sea. If you effectively control or heavily contest both of those straits, you have your hands firmly around the throat of the global supply chain.
It is a deliberate economic chokehold. The analysis states explicitly that the Houthis firing at commercial shipping isn't just a military maneuver to swat down a few cargo ships or drag the U.S. Navy into a skirmish. It's a calculated strategy designed to crush energy markets. I mean, if oil and liquid natural gas cannot safely transit out of the Middle East, the global economy begins to grind to a halt. Insurance premiums for shipping skyrocket, inflation goes berserk, and suddenly governments in Europe and Asia are facing domestic political crises over the cost of fuel.
What is truly fascinating for military analysts here is the incredible asymmetry of how the two sides are fighting this economic war.
Right, the mismatch in resources.
Exactly. The United States relies almost entirely on projecting power through massive, incredibly expensive naval deployments. The text mentions the shifting of aircraft carriers, specifically noting that the USS Gerald R. Ford was leaving the region while they waited for the USS George H.W. Bush to arrive.
And these carrier strike groups are floating cities. They cost billions of dollars to build, millions of dollars a day to operate, and require an immense, highly complex logistical tail. just to keep them stationed in the Red Sea.
And the math of engaging the enemy is almost comically lopsided.
Oh, absolutely. An American destroyer might fire a $2 million SM-2 interceptor missile to shoot down a $20,000 Houthi drone made of fiberglass and commercial electronics.
You don't need a degree in economics to see that the U.S. cannot win a war of attrition where the cost-exchange ratio is 100-to-1 in favor of the adversary.
It completely inverts the cost-benefit analysis of modern power projection.
It does. And as the text points out, Iran and the Axis of Resistance are playing a long, long game of attrition. They are perfectly comfortable with a slow, grinding, low-intensity war because they are operating on their home turf.
Right.
They don't have to sail a billion-dollar ship thousands of miles across the ocean. They just have to sit in a mountain cave in Yemen and fire cheap, mass-produced anti-ship missiles at highly expensive, highly visible targets.
It's like playing a game of chess, where one player, the U.S., has a timer aggressively ticking down. The U.S. has domestic election cycles, they have severe taxpayer fatigue regarding foreign wars, and they desperately need a quick off-ramp to declare a victory and bring the ships home.
Yep.
But the other player, the Axis of Resistance, has all day. They don't have the same democratic pressure cooker. They are perfectly happy to sit back, wait, and let the timer tick while the global economy starts to panic.
And it is precisely that ticking timer, colliding with the reality of an unwinnable war of attrition, that leads to the extreme, almost delusional negotiating positions we see outlined in the analysis.
Right, because with the global economy essentially held hostage, and both sides bleeding resources, what does the end game actually look like? What are the actual demands being put on the table to stop the missiles from flying?
Well, let's break down these demands, because when you look at them side by side, it feels like neither side is operating in the same reality.
Totally. Let's start with the U.S. demands placed on Iran, as outlined by Nawfal. The U.S. wants Iran to completely dismantle its nuclear facilities, explicitly demanding the closure of the Fordo and Isfahan sites. They want Iran to permanently cease all uranium enrichment. They want strict limits on the ballistic missile arsenal. They demand that Iran cut off all support for its proxy groups, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, and they demand the unconditional reopening of the Strait of Hormuz.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, strategically, that is not a negotiation. It is a demand for the total unconditional surrender and dismantling of Iran's entire defensive architecture. It asks them to voluntarily disarm themselves in a hostile region.
Exactly. And then you look at Iran's demands, which are equally extreme. Iran demands an immediate, permanent end to all kinetic strikes. They want binding, ironclad guarantees that they will never be attacked again.
Right.
They want all U.S. military bases completely removed from the entire Middle Eastern region. They are demanding massive war reparations. They want all economic sanctions lifted. And they want recognized sovereign control over the Strait of Hormuz.
When you lay those two lists out, it becomes painfully obvious that neither side will ever accept the other's terms.
Never.
They represent mutually exclusive realities. The U.S. demands require Iran to systematically defang itself, which the Iranian leadership views as institutional suicide. Conversely, Iran's demands require the U.S. to completely abandon its project of maintaining unipolar hegemony in the Middle East, which Washington views as entirely unacceptable.
So we are staring at a total, intractable stalemate. And this is where the conversation takes a very dark turn in the source. Because the implication is that since the U.S. cannot diplomatically force Iran to agree to these terms, the alternative is sheer annihilation.
Yes. The analysis suggests that the U.S. and Israel would rather systematically bomb Iran until it collapses into a failed state, drawing grim comparisons to Iraq, Libya, or Syria, than ever allow Iran to maintain a pathway to a nuclear weapon.
And on the flip side, Wastami implies that Iran's threshold for pain is incredibly high. They've survived over 40 years of crippling economic sanctions. They endured an 8-year bloodbath with Iraq in the 1980s. They are psychologically prepared to endure massive infrastructure punishment.
And furthermore, their long-term strategic response to the threat of becoming a failed state will be to finally cross the threshold and officially become a declared nuclear power. They view the bomb as the ultimate deterrent against forced regime change.
Which instantly triggers a geopolitical panic attack for anyone trying to model regional stability. Nawfal brings up a very specific, deeply rooted fear here. He asks, if Iran officially gets a nuclear weapon, won't Saudi Arabia just instantly buy one to match them?
The proliferation fear?
Yes. He specifically references the historical shadow of the AQ Khan network. The Pakistani scientist who illegally proliferated nuclear tech. The fear is that Saudi Arabia, sitting on endless billions of petrodollars, will simply write a blank check to Pakistan, buy a nuclear warhead off the shelf, and spark an instant nuclear arms race in the Middle East.
It's a terrifying hypothetical, and it's one that Western media brings up constantly. But what is truly fascinating is how bluntly Rostami dismisses this idea as complete fantasy.
He doesn't even entertain the premise. But why? If you have unlimited money and there are black markets, why can't you just buy the ultimate weapon?
Because, as Rostami details, nuclear sovereignty is not a turnkey product you can just order from a defense catalog, regardless of how deep your sovereign wealth fund is.
Right.
Rostami insists that having immense financial capital does not equate to having the deep indigenous academic and scientific infrastructure required to actually build, safely maintain, and sustain a nuclear weapons program.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that. You might be able to bribe someone to hand you a physical warhead, maybe. But you can't buy the decades of institutional knowledge.
Exactly.
You can't buy the generations of theoretical physicists, the nuclear engineers, the materials scientists, and the heavy water facility operators needed to keep that fissile material stable and functional.
A nuclear program is a living, highly complex ecosystem. Rostami states that Saudi Arabia is decades away from having the domestic educational pipeline and the indigenous scientific knowledge to match what Iran has methodically built internally over the last 40 years.
It's indigenous knowledge.
Exactly. You cannot just buy nuclear sovereignty and expect it to work as a credible deterrent. It has to be organically cultivated. And that requires an academic foundation and an amount of time that they simply do not have in the current crisis.
So once again, the illusion of wealth providing ultimate security is completely shattered. You can have all the money in the world, you can buy all the fighter jets, you can even try to buy a bomb, but if you don't have the internal scientific foundation and the sovereign authority, you are inherently vulnerable.
Which is leading to a massive psychological shift in the Middle East.
Yes, and this brings us to the final and perhaps most consequential part of the analysis, the shifting sands and the emergence of a new regional architecture.
The analysis describes what can only be categorized as a watershed moment in the conflict, a specific, undeniable event that is fundamentally rewiring public opinion across the entire Arab world.
And it revolves around an extraordinarily brazen Israeli airstrike. The operational details of this strike, as laid out in the analysis, are absolutely astonishing.
They are.
The text claims that 15 Israeli fighter jets flew completely unchallenged over sovereign Saudi Arabian airspace, proceeded to bomb a target in Qatar. The text names Dhahran, and then those 15 jets casually turned around and flew all the way back to Israel.
Without a single intercept.
Not a single anti-aircraft battery fired. Not a single Arab interceptor jet was scrambled to challenge them as they violated the airspace of multiple sovereign nations.
The psychological fallout from that single event is immense. It forced a profound, deeply uncomfortable reckoning for the citizens of those Arab nations.
You can practically hear the citizens asking the logical question. If our governments, with all these billions of dollars in Western weapons, cannot stop 15 jets from violating our airspace, who can actually defend us? What exactly is all this money for?
This specific event, according to Rostami, is acting as an accelerant. It's causing historical, rigid alliances and divisions to simply crumble.
The Sunni-Shia divide.
Yes. For decades, the geopolitics of the Middle East were often defined by Western analysts along the Sunni-Shia divide. It was a neat metric, but Rostami argues that this sectarian divide is rapidly evaporating in the minds of the broader public.
He makes a point of saying he gets messages every single day from Sunni citizens across the Gulf who are completely disillusioned with their own government's impotence.
The cognitive dissonance is breaking them away from state narratives. They're beginning to view the Iranian-led axis of resistance through a completely different lens.
Right.
Instead of seeing Iran as the historical sectarian enemy, the Arab street is increasingly viewing Israel as the true, unrestrained, destabilizing force in the region, and they are beginning to see their own incredibly wealthy governments as hopelessly weak.
So what does this actually mean for the geopolitical future of the region? Rostami lays out an ultimate vision, and if it comes to pass, it represents a radical departure from the last 50 years of history. He envisions a new regional security architecture where Arab states realize that their long-term prosperity and physical security rely on forging mutual defense treaties and economic integration directly with Iran, rather than relying on the U.S. and Israel.
And what's vital is that he grounds this vision in deep civilizational history. He points out that Iran is not merely a modern post-1979 political regime. It is a profound, historical, multicultural, civilizational entity that has existed for thousands of years. It has a long history of coexistence. Rostami insists that Iran does not view states like Turkey or Qatar or even Saudi Arabia as inherent permanent enemies. The long-term goal of Tehran is a self-sustaining, secure region entirely free from external Western superpower domination.
It's the difference between being a collection of proxy states
Yeah.
and becoming a unified geopolitical bloc. So as we pull back and wrap up this deep dive, let's just take a breath and look at the sheer distance we've covered today.
The trajectory of this conflict is a masterclass in the unintended consequences of warfare.
We started by dismantling the spectacular failure of the regime change fantasy, the arrogant assumption that pressure automatically equals compliance.
We looked at the myth of omnipotent intelligence, showing how leveling a neighborhood to kill one man is a catastrophic failure of data.
We watched the conflict spiral into a grinding war of attrition on multiple fronts. We analyzed the terrifying vulnerability of the wealthy Gulf states, trapped between Iranian asymmetric warfare and their own tethered American hardware.
And we mapped out how the weaponization of maritime chokepoints is putting a ticking timer on the global economy.
And finally, we look at how 15 unchallenged fighter jets managed to crack the psychological foundation of the Sunni-Shia divide, paving the way for a radically new regional architecture.
And if there is one overarching lesson here, the thread that connects all these complex parts for you, the listener, it is the sheer existential danger of assumption.
Yes.
In a world of infinite data, real-time satellite tracking, and massive defense budgets, this conflict proves that assuming a linear, predictable outcome in war is incredibly dangerous. It reminds us to constantly question the inevitability of any global superpower's grand plans.
Because the map they draw in Washington or Tel Aviv is rarely the territory they encounter on the ground. When you strip away the assumptions, the spreadsheets, and the mythology, the mechanical reality underneath is often shocking. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today. It's the haunting, logical conclusion of everything we've discussed about power, wealth, and sovereignty. Think back to those immensely wealthy Gulf states and their billions of dollars of shiny new defense spending. If a nation can spend hundreds of billions of dollars on the world's most advanced fighter jets and radar systems, but lacks the sovereign authority or the indigenous scientific knowledge to actually use them when their airspace is violated, are they truly an independent country? Or are they just a heavily armed tenant in a global superpower's rental property? Think about that next time you look at a map of global alliances. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.